right, great to see everybody this morning. I did put a new sheet on the back table last week for chapter 12, and if you have not yet had a chance to grab chapter 12 notes, you'll need those today. We have just a few things to finish in chapter 11, but we are almost immediately going to be in chapter 12, and you might like to have a copy of those notes as we begin our journey through chapter 12. So let's turn to Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to finish up just the last couple of verses, just a few things at the very end of chapter 11, and then we'll be straightway into chapter 12. All we want to do is just examine a couple of statements he makes, the writer does, about the people in that chapter. And we're going to see a continuation of it as soon as we get into chapter 12. I hope everybody will plan to be here Tuesday night. Kyle Butt is here. We love Kyle. He always does a great job. And we're excited that he'll be here. We have several families that they're on vacation this week, going off, taking some vacations this week, taking their families. And I know of a couple of VBSs in the area. Well, June is a busy month for VBS anyway, but we've got a few this week that are having. I think Bethel is having theirs and a few others. So really reach out and invite folks. We've had a great average for our attendance. I think if you average the 2 nights, we're over 250 in attendance for the 2 nights. I think 273 and 229 or something like that, so an average of 251. But we've had great attendance this year, and I expect our numbers may go down just a tad with all the VBSs and people on vacation, but everybody will be here. It's going to be great. It's been great. The lessons have been great. The singing has been great. There were several comments made about the singing Sunday night. Or Tuesday night. It was awesome. The singing was so good Tuesday night. And just it's so encouraging, the services are. So let's do our best to really promote it and share it with others and invite folks to be here. Okay, right at the end of chapter 11, we finished our discussion of all the folks that are mentioned and some of the circumstances that were applied to them. Even at the end, the stoning and the sawing in two and the being slain with the sword, we talked about all that. And then he says in verse 38, of whom the world was not worthy. And then we talked about this. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves. And then he comes back to that and says, all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So there's 3 things that the writer says at the end of the chapter about these wonderful heroes of faith from chapter 11. The first thing is in verse 38. He says, of whom the world was not worthy. What does he mean by that? In what sense was the world not worthy of these people? Okay, and that's it, Bobby? Yeah, the world didn't appreciate it. And the world itself, when you consider the world, right, not specific people within the world, but what's the state of the world like? What's it been like for a long time? It's just sinful. And when you consider the mighty acts of faith by the folks that are mentioned, Abraham and Noah and their righteousness, and you consider that against the wickedness of the world, wow, the world didn't deserve that. The world's just completely undeserving of such people because their character was far above what this world is, and eventually the world that claimed their life. So they weren't worthy of it. The second thing is in verse 39, he says God gave them a good report. He gave them good testimony. They have obtained a good testimony through faith, meaning in spite of the world's opposition, their record stands out head and shoulders above the rest. There's another thing here, it's sort of combined. There's 2 things that are combined at the end. And I admit this is a harder thing when he says, they didn't receive the promise, and that they were not made perfect apart from us. Obviously, this is like earlier in the chapter when he talks about the others, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Noah and others. It says they did not receive the promise, meaning on this earth while they were alive, but they have received it since death. It was reserved for what was after death for these, just like it is for us, after their own, and plus after the resurrection. But when he says that they should not be made perfect apart from us, what does that mean? Because it's kind of an obscure, hard statement, isn't it? What does it mean that they were not made perfect apart from us? Okay, it almost sounds like the ability of those folks to be blessed depended on the us in this passage. Well, who would that be, or what's that a reference to, do you think? Sure. Oh, okay. So are the blessings of the past dependent upon the completion of the New Testament scheme of redemption? Yeah, and that's what he's been talking, right? The Lord came, and look at all the fulfillment of prophecy, and look at all the blessings that are now in Christ, and everybody in ages past, well, their blessings depended on that. This to me is a lot like Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 4, where he's dealing with the forgiveness issue, and he says, independent, away from everything, those bulls and goats, they couldn't take away sin. Because it depended upon the better sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So they could not have been perfected apart from the entrance of Christianity or the Lord. Those two things are tied together. So he ends with some very wonderful plaudits for the people in this passage. So let's now move to chapter 12. We're making our way out of chapter 11. Let's move to chapter 12. I want to read about the first 11 verses to kind of frame where he's going with this. And then we're going to go back, and we've got a sheet of paper with some notes on it. We'll look at least two or so of these questions. All right, verse 1. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chasten us, as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. All right, so here's the first question that kind of gets us through the first two verses. And we might have just a tad bit of overlap in the questions. First question is this: how does the writer now apply all the things that we were talking about in chapter 11? How does he apply the previous chapter? And also, what is the sin which so easily ensnares us? And is there a specific sin that is that sin, or is this something that is something else, or is it just like one thing that we all struggle with? So let's take the first part of that. Do you think he's now moving, and I know this is one of those, it would probably be better not to have them like this, but this is one of those where the man that was putting the chapter divisions in the Bible hit the bump in the road and he wrote chapter 12 and probably didn't need to be there. But do you see a continuation of the discussion between chapter 11 and chapter 12 now? What's the first thing that gives it away? Yeah, therefore. It just immediately tells us we're about to get the conclusion of the whole argument in chapter 11. So if that's true, and it is, what's the conclusion? What's he telling us now? What do you think is the conclusion he's offering us?
Look at the great example that you have around you. You can remain faithful.
Okay.
Stay a Christian.
Other people have endured a trial of faith, and they made it. You are enduring a trial of faith, and you can make it. Now, he's about to present the most premier example of enduring hardship. Who's the best example ever of enduring hardship? All right, Christ is, Jesus. So if Jesus can do it, and by the way, he did it as a man, and these people back in chapter 11 can do it, you can do it too. So it's not so hard that you cannot make it, and that's his argument here. And we see that again, like you mentioned, you see the word therefore, which is the conclusion. We're sure that chapter 12 is part of this discussion. And so that tells us a little bit about verse 1. So I don't know why this is debated as much as it is. To me, this seems, this is a no-brainer. When he says that we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, who are those? Those, the people back in chapter 11. That makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know why there's ever debate and commentaries over that, but there is. But these are the folks back in chapter 11. Now, those heroes of faith back in chapter 11. There's a word picture here. I do want to explore this just a little bit. He says, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And interestingly, the word that's used for cloud there literally means a mass of clouds, a massive cloud. And it's a word picture because in our mind, we can see it. You look up on a day when you have those puffy, billowing clouds, and we can almost envision that in word picture, that's how it's set up. And so there's two senses in which this might be taken. I'll get your thoughts on this. Some take this to mean, because they are a cloud of witnesses, some take this to mean that those people back in chapter 11 are now looking down on, for example, the readers, and they're looking down with empathy on the readers as they endure this. Do you think that's what's being mentioned here? And if not, then why would you not think that?
They can't see us.
Ah, can't see us?
Well, the example of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man,
Yep.
he didn't know what his brothers were doing. He just knew if they came there, they were going to be in trouble. He didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, so let's do that. Let's go to Luke 16. I think Gene and Art I agree with both of you. Luke 16. We have in Scripture very few passages that actually deal with the perspective of people who are in Hades. You know, we just have very little perspective on that. And this is the best passage we have on what the people in the Hadean realm actually are capable of seeing. And begin in verse 19. There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. There was a beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Now we know what happens in verse 22. They die. It was the case that the beggar died. He was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died. He was buried. Being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. Now, what do we learn about what can be seen in this passage? There's at least something that can be seen. People in torment can at least see what's going on over in paradise, because maybe that's part of the torment, because he sees the comfort of Lazarus. And then he cried, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I'm tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, which means that apparently Abraham is also able to understand what's happening with this man on the other side. Remember that in your lifetime you receive your good things, likewise Lazarus evil things. Now he's comforted, you are tormented. And then he mentions there's a great gulf fixed between us. You can't pass, nobody can pass from one side to the other. And then what happens from verse 27 to 31, his concern over the five brothers, and by the way, there does come a time when it's too late to be concerned for your loved ones. And it's obviously too late for this man to be concerned for his loved ones. He can't do anything about it. But he expresses concern, and he clearly does not know the state of his brothers upon the earth. He doesn't know what's going on, but he feels confident if somebody could go back from the dead, then they would believe. He feels that way, but there's nothing to indicate that he ever saw that. And there's no indication in Scripture anywhere that those who've gone beyond, other than the Lord himself, are capable of looking back down on us. So there's no indication that anybody would be able to witness what's upon the earth, including the folks in chapter 11, like Abraham and Noah and those folks, looking down on us and I don't know what the point of that would be, but there's no indication they can do that. Tommy and then Art.
Well, I think this goes along with what I believe Ecclesiastes 9:5 says, talking about the dead know nothing.
Yeah.
It's not that they're not aware, and a lot of people take that verse to mean that when you're dead, you're like you're passed out,
Yeah.
you don't know anything.
Yeah.
They don't know what's going on in this world. They're aware of things, but they don't know what's going on in this world.
Yeah, and yeah, that's exactly right. Jehovah's Witnesses and some others teach that soul sleep annihilation stuff, and they do believe that. Art?
I'm kind of looking forward to not having to worry about it,
Yeah, wouldn't,
not knowing about it.
yeah. Free from the cares of this world. That's got to mean something when that's said. The other half of that is this. When he says a cloud of witnesses, what's the testimony here? What's the witness? Is it what they're looking down on us?
Well, it's a foreshadow.
The witness is what we see in them, in their example of faith. So it doesn't make sense that this is a downward witness, that they're watching us, which can only mean the second option I think is true here in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, that the witness is for us. It's what we observe in them. Their actions of faith bear witness to the ability of faith to endure and of the faithfulness of God. So it's what we are observing in those folks. That's their witness. And by the way, he did say in verse 39 of the previous chapter that they've obtained good testimony. That's the witness that's a cloud for us in chapter 12, verse 1. And there's a good point here. I went back and added to my notes after this. I was just thinking in verse 1, and this is what we all want, isn't it? Does this passage, when we understand it correctly, this cloud of witnesses, that's all those folks who left good testimony for us, does this speak to the importance of leaving a legacy of faith behind for the people that we're no longer able to see? And sometimes I feel like, I think I'm right in this assessment, I feel like the legacy that we leave, so many times what we're striving to leave is everything but faith for people. You can be financially responsible and you can leave something for your kids, but is that as important as faith? And there are a lot of people today who would probably better benefit from an example of faith being left than from any other thing. In fact, we would all be that way. And it's the one thing that always endures. Money will be forgotten and stuff is forgotten, but faith is important, not just for your name and for the people who follow, but for history. And it's I think this is just a great point about the importance of leaving a legacy of faith behind. And now we know how to do it because look what they did in chapter 11. That's how we do it. We act by faith, and we can influence generations to follow behind us. In fact, these folks in chapter 11 are still influencing us. And I just think that's an important point. All right. So now we have a couple of really interesting statements about, well, there's some word pictures about making sure that we don't get bogged down with sin and the life of this world, that it prevents us from reaching our goal. So there's two statements. One is, let's lay aside every weight. And the word here means a mass, a bulk, something sizable. And there's a word picture here. Do you know what the word picture is? And put it in the context of the end of this when he says, endure the race that's set before us. What would this have reference to when he says, make sure you clean up the weight in the context of a race? You know what he's talking about? What is it? Okay, hurdles in the way. If you were running a race, and let's say, because we'll talk about this in a moment, the word picture seems to be more like a marathon style race than it is a sprint to the end. If you were going to run 30 miles, and you know that 15 miles in, your body's going to be aching, and mentally you're just going to want to quit it, what would be important at the beginning of the race? Would you want to put a rucksack on that weighed about 80 pounds? You'd want to jettison that weight. Or in the first century, if you were typically a person who wore long, loose, flowing robes, you'd probably want to find a way to clear that up, because at some point those things are going to be an impediment. They're going to stop you from the race. And that's the word picture here of an athlete, a runner who throws off unnecessary weight in order to finish the race. You wouldn't want, if you're going to run a race, even a sprint, but if you're running a marathon, you would not want to wear a hoodie and it's cool outside and you have 5 layers of sweatpants on. That's not going to benefit you in the race. You're going to want to be sleek. And by the way, not that Paul is telling us, or whoever wrote this is telling us that, but in the first century, the Greeks, do you know how they ran? Naked. All right, they had no impediment to them at all. And he's certainly drawing off of a word picture, but he's telling us, make sure that you're able to make it to the end. So we have to get rid of every single thing that would impede us from reaching the goal of heaven. We could probably pair this with what Paul, we know he did say in 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8, when he says, I have finished the course, and I've run the race, fought the good fight of the faith. And so that's what we have to do. I'd like to offer another passage that I think kind of goes along with this. Hold your place and go with me to Matthew chapter 5. I think this is a great companion passage for this. Matthew chapter 5. All right, so let's start in verse 27. It's a long chapter. Matthew 5, Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus begins by saying, you've heard that it was said to those of old, you should not have committed adultery. Okay. Now, we've discussed this plenty of times studying the Sermon on the Mount before. They had a habit of saying, if he condemned adultery was wrong, but everything up to that would be okay. And he's saying, nope, it goes further than that. All goes back to the heart. I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now watch what he says. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it's more profitable for you that one of your members should perish, but that your whole body should be cast into hell. Is he calling for self-mutilation here? No. What's he saying? Church discipline. What's from a personal perspective, what would he be telling us to do? Anything that would cause me to lose my eternity with God, I need to get rid of that. And from a practical perspective, all of us know where our areas of temptation lie, and we know the things that would probably cause us to go into that, and we have to cut that stuff off. And that's the idea here. Now, to do this, you'd have to be honest with yourself. You'd have to be honest to be able to put the baggage away and lay aside every weight. You'd have to be courageous enough to do it. You'd have to request help if needed. But so the writer is now telling us, in order for us to reach the goal, you got to take the extra weight off. Yeah, pride would be part of that. And let's talk about that in just a second. I think we can make a good application on that in just a second. Here's the second language. He says, and the sin that so easily ensnares us. The sin that so easily ensnares us, entangles us. Interestingly, the language here, the word means to skillfully surround us. The idea is we're just completely surrounded by some sin. Now, there are people who think this is a single sin, one single thing that is common to all Christians, and that's what the writer is calling for. Do you think that's what he's saying? No? Tom?
No, I think that, I know there are words in English language that have singular and plural meanings. And sin is one of them. Sin can be plurality.
Yeah, sins, general.
You don't have to add an S to it.
Right.
And I think that's what he's saying.
Yeah, sin in general. Yeah, I agree. I don't think the writer's saying that one sin that we all commit often, that's the one you need to stay away from. Gene?
Well, consistent with what he's saying here, the Jews have lost sight of the end goal.
Yes?
They considered an earthly kingdom and foolish pride and a myriad of things that caused them not to see why Christ came. And that's what he's addressing with them. So the sin that so easily beset
Yes. For them, it was unbelief. 100%. For them, it was unbelief. But does every single person struggle with that same sin? Sure. Yeah. In a generic sense, but for example, some people really struggle with sexual sin. But does everybody struggle with sexual sin? Well, then it can't be just one single thing that applies across the board. Bobby, you had and Tommy?
I was just gonna say, in the context of what we've been reading here, I think a lot of it deals with their lack of faith.
Oh, sure. That's what Gene was saying. I think it's unbelief that they were struggling with.
Well, in life, the older we get, the wiser we should become with life's experiences, in the fact that when we come up against something that causes us trouble in our lives, we should be able to recognize that and distance ourselves from
Yeah.
that. A lot of people are not like that. It's almost like they heap upon themselves things that cause them trouble in life.
Yeah.
And I think the writer here is saying that anything, any kind of sin, get away from it.
You know, I think that's it. I think it's because going back to the question, in this room, do we all struggle with the same sins? So some people aren't tempted by some things, but they're really tempted by other things. But the idea is, whatever the sin is that seems to be surrounding you, you've got to put that away. You've got to be smart enough to know that that is an area of weakness for us, because like Gene was saying here in the letter to the Hebrews, they were really struggling with unbelief. And I guess in a sense we all struggle with that, but other people struggle with other things, and whatever they struggle with might not be mine. Jimmy just mentioned pride. A lot of people struggle with pride. And again, in a generic sense, maybe we all do struggle with that, but some people they really struggle with lying. But not everybody struggles with lying. Some people are great at telling the truth. Some people struggle with drugs, and some people don't. And some people struggle with sexual sins, and some don't. And some steal, and some don't. And some people are lazy, and some people aren't lazy. And so the point would be, whatever the sin is that seems to be so easily finding you and surrounding you, get rid of that. Find a way to deal with it. My question would be, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, why do some people seem to struggle with some sins and other people don't struggle with those same sins? Why do you think that is?
I think it goes back to our adversary, the devil.
Yeah.
He knows where our weakness is.
He does? Yeah. Art?
We're told if we resist sin, the devil will flee. And there is a point where, I'm going to make an example. I don't think that I would ever be tempted by alcohol.
Right.
Never. I mean, there's been times in the past maybe, but I don't think I'm past that.
Sure.
I don't think that's, so I think that's more, once you get, at some point in your life, you say, wait a minute, I know I'm on this track. I know I'm on this path.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to this, and you can't knock me off.
Yeah. And then other people do struggle with that. So I just think maybe there's some internal and external factors that go into that.
Well, a lot of sin is enjoyable temporarily.
Yeah, we talked about that last week.
As human beings, we want to be happy, we want to feel good, we
Yeah.
want things to make us, feel alive. And a lot of people go to those things for that, and they have trouble separating that, doing away with it. But they don't really look at the long picture. They're looking at the temporary of what's going to get them through, what feels good.
Yep.
But in the long run, it's all futile, it's all destructive.
Yeah, Gloria?
I think the upbringing that you have,
I think those are big factors. Yeah.
all of that enters.
Those are huge social factors, environmental factors, and they all influence us. Some of it has to do with our temperament too. So our disposition inclines us a lot to those types of things. Like if you see somebody growing up and they have, I guess you could call it addictive personalities. They just, they do things and they like to. They're very routine. There might be a potential for, if they get involved in alcohol or they get involved in drugs, they might potentially get really hooked on something like that. There might be a greater propensity for that. But they might not ever be tempted by lying. It just may not ever tempt them at all. So I think, like Gloria was saying, external factors like growing up in a certain environment, or maybe the peers we put ourselves around, or social influences, whatever it is, we gravitate towards some sins, not naturally, it's not ingrained, it's just that some sins are more tempting to us than others are. And once we, I think Bobby was saying earlier, once we give in, well, then that door is open and the devil really shoves that stuff around, surrounds us with that, so we'll be near it. Gene?
Well, we're all basically created equal.
Sure.
But that's why we're here. You know, everything that we produce, that we make, has great potential. But what the proof of the pudding is in the taste.
Yep.
So that's what life is all about, to learn and to prepare ourselves for heaven. And we either succeed at that or we fail.
Yeah, if we take and we put those two statements together, lay aside all the weight and then set aside the sin that so easily ensnares us. If you take the last one first and layer it over the top one, if we know what our weaknesses are, and we all have weaknesses. We have areas where we give in to a certain thing more easily than we do others. These are the things that so easily surround us. Then we know what it is, and we can try to take and set the boundaries up and do whatever we need to do to keep that stuff from entering in. So, for example, we've used this illustration before. If there was somebody, male or female, because it's not just male, but it's male or female, if somebody was greatly tempted to look at, for example, pornography online, right? It just stimulated them like a drug, and they were involved in that, then should they take steps to avoid being around pornography? If they're so easily ensnared by that, then what could they potentially do to lay aside the weight? Do you need to be alone on a computer? Probably not. You probably need to do that with people in the room so you're not tempted by that. If you were greatly tempted to be involved in sexual sin and commit adultery against your spouse, then probably what would you never want to do? Probably never want to be alone with somebody that would be tempting to you. You'd probably never want to do that. You'd want to set up the boundaries. And the writer's now saying, whatever it is that could potentially keep you from heaven, you need to get that out. Find a way to keep it out of your life. And here's the reason. Look at verse 1. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Those things keep us from finishing the race. And now the writer's saying, whatever it is, get it out, because it'll stop you from reaching the finish line. And we want to do that. We want to run with endurance the race that is set before us. Here's an interesting thing. The word that's used here, the race, is the word we get our English word from, agony. Almost directly transliterated out of the original. It's agonizing, which tells us this is not a walk in the park, and this is not a real, like a 100-yard sprint to the finish. This is like a grueling marathon where you hit the wall and you're really struggling to finish. And the tendency is to faint along the way, and we give up because of exhaustion. And the only way to make it is with endurance or with patience, steadfastness. The word used of someone who's not swayed from his purpose. And so we want to really hang in there. And he's making the point, we can do it. They did it, the Lord did it, and we can do it as well. And I think at the end of chapter 11, he's made the point that some of those folks in chapter 11 have endured a lot more than the readers have endured, and certainly a lot more than we've ever endured, and yet if they can stand up to that stuff, then we can do it too. Any thoughts before we move to the next question?
I just want to emphasize pride and humility.
Yeah.
Or opposite.
Yep.
And we tend to be prideful on any sin.
Sure.
And what we should be doing is humbling ourselves before God to get rid of those
Yeah.
sins.
There's no way to address sin with pride standing there, because pride, we justify it, we find a way to excuse it. That's what pride does, and you're exactly right about that. And humility is the very opposite of that. It's being honest and being pliable to the will of God. Very, very good point. All right, number 2, verses 2 through 4. The sacrifice of Jesus has incredible practical effect. That's what he's about to show us, is how he died, and it has this effect on us, right? So there's a practical effect that we can take from his death. And so the question is, what encouragement should we take from it, from the sacrifice of Jesus in verses 2 through 4? What are your thoughts initially on this? What does his sacrifice, what should it help us do? Lift our spirits, help us to be encouraged. Any other thoughts? I mean, yes, obviously redemption, but Art?
Very few of us will ever have to suffer like he did.
Yeah, I think that's part of his point there, that there's a kind of suffering he endured that we've not been called to. Maybe at some point, but none of us have experienced it. And if he can do it, then we can do it as well. Gene, did you have your hand up?
No, but
Oh, sorry.
the bottom line is, even if we could endure the physical suffering
Yes.
that he went over, I doubt that any of us could withstand the weight of the sin of the world.
Yeah. The mental and spiritual weight that was placed upon him. I think that's true. So in this race, notice what he says at the very beginning in verse 2. Looking unto Jesus, all right? So we have now this, it's still part of the same word picture. We're running in the race, and what's the goal? Jesus is the goal. We're trying to make it to Jesus. We can focus on Jesus, which means we're not looking where? And they were doing that in Hebrews. They were looking behind them. Do you remember how? And the days gone by. And he said, don't do that. You're supposed to be looking ahead of you. So you look ahead of you. It is said that the most successful runners always do that. They always set their eyes on something far ahead of them. And they run to that point, and then they set their eyes on something. They run to that point, set their eyes on something. Because if you're looking at the ground or you're worried about what's behind you, you exhaust quickly. And that's a word picture that's carried on through this idea of focusing on Jesus. All right, so now he sets his work before us. And it has this practical effect. Now, because of what he did, the writer says he has become the author and the finisher of our faith. The word author here means the chief leader, the pioneer, the prince of something. Literally one that takes the lead and thus provides an example. So by what he did, he provides an example for us of how to handle our own life. He's the finisher, or literally the perfecter of our faith. One who has in his own person raised faith to its perfection and set before us the highest example of faith. So the point is, we're on the road and we're running on this road, and Jesus has already completed the very journey that we're on. He's run that race. He's already trod the steps that we're putting our feet on, and it shows how it is possible to make it to heaven, of course, now through him. So the question becomes, well, how did he do that? How was he capable of doing that? We'll have to pause it and come back. But he's going to say some things. He endured what he did with joy. How could he do that? He despised shame. What does that mean? And he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And then you see verse 3, he takes this hostility from sinners, and he endures that somehow, and he does that, and then we can do it to a point that we're not wearied and discouraged. And then he'll talk about you have not resisted to bloodshed. We'll mention that, and then we'll move on hopefully quickly through verse 11 next week, and then as far as we can get into the chapter. Thank you so much for your good input today. Really appreciate it. And if you don't have a copy of the notes, grab those, and we'll make sure that we follow those discussion points for our class. Thank you guys. Appreciate your good help today.